Welcome everyone to the second panel of the Future of Mining Law Conference. We're so glad that you've joined us for this discussion that's focused on communities and community experiences. And the conference organizers have asked us in this session to focus on the topic of community resistance. Why might communities resist? What are communities resisting? And what guidance might we offer from experience of communities for other stakeholders, for companies, for governments, for other actors in the field? I'm Christy Disney Bruckner, Executive Director of Sustainable Development Strategies Group and Senior Policy Advisor for the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance, IRMA. And it's my pleasure to facilitate this panel. And I'll start by introducing you to Amy Boulanger, who is Executive Director of IRMA, and will share with us a bit of background on IRMA and introduce our panel. Amy?
Thanks so much for having me, Christy. And it's such an honor to be here with this wonderful panel and great to be part of this law summit. So background on the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance. It was developed over 14 years of a dialogue across diverse stakeholders, and the idea being, can we craft a shared definition of what would be best practices in protecting environmental and social values where industrial scale mining happens? And can we do that around the world for a full range of mined materials? And so it now exists as a voluntary initiative and standard covering all mined materials except the energy fuel sector. So you can use it equally for issues where copper is being extracted, or gold, or diamonds, or lithium, this full range. What is important to know about it, is now the most comprehensive, detailed, and comprehensive by breadth of issues covered, and also the most rigorous definition, the highest bar of best practices that could be achieved at industrial scale mines globally. It's also the only voluntary initiative and global standard for mining which is equally led by nonprofit and affected communities and labor unions working alongside private sector companies, both mining companies and companies who purchase mined materials from them. So it's that one place where the communities most affected can have a direct voice and oversight in how the system is governed, and its accountability across stakeholder sectors, direct to the issues you introduced with Christy. Why are communities resisting industrial scale extraction? They have that direct ability to speak to that and how this system is governed, and holding accountability there for the claims made, and also driving continuous improvement. We know that what's considered best practices today in environmental and social responsibility will be different in years to come. And so with that, I'll hand back to you, and happy to share other things on how IRMA works in creating a standard and then measuring mines' performance against that standard, and providing accountability across diverse stakeholder groups as we seek to create that greater value in the marketplace for environmental and social responsibility.
Thank you so much, Amy. Well, let's start by talking about, from each of our perspectives, this phrase, community resistance. And I wonder, for each of our panelists, what does community resistance mean to you? And what are some of the key circumstances currently driving community resistance? And I'd like to start with Nusmata Jacinda Mack, who has served as coordinator of First Nations women advocating responsible mining, and will share some of her experience with us on this panel. Nusmata?
Thanks, Christy. Yeah, my name is Luz Kamara, also known as Jacinda Mack, and I'm from the Nukjalk and Secwepemc Indigenous peoples in what is known as modern-day British Columbia, Canada. And our experiences here in Canada, dealing with Canadian mining companies in our territories, has been it's been a lot of work. Resistance, as defined by the industry, is our right to say no. It's about talking about our human rights. It's about protecting water and protecting the lands that we still heavily rely on for food, for our own trade networks that heavily depend on food. So we've got some really basic human rights protections that we're working towards. And in my experience, in my home territory in 2014, we had the Mount Poly mine disaster. And this was a really defining moment for, I think, in our nation in understanding the real potential risks of mining. And so resistance in our community, I wouldn't call it resistance. I would say that it's actually a coming together of our community around understanding our human rights and around fully understanding and being able to make fully informed decisions about mining within our lands. And we also have to understand that mining in many places is directly linked to colonization and the impacts of colonization. So it's a very complex and really wide-ranging conversations that come into dealing with mines and what mines label as resistance. And I feel like there's a lot more education that's happening, and therefore there's a lot more discussion happening, and the mines are experiencing it more as resistance. And this is a building up and a reclaiming of our responsibilities as communities and of taking care of the land.
Thank you, Nusmata. It is wonderful to see communities coming together on local levels and also regionally and globally as well. So let's turn to you, Dewa. Dewa Mavhinga is the Southern Africa Director with the Africa Division of Human Rights Watch. Dewa, what does community resistance mean to you, and what do you see as some of the key drivers of community resistance?
Thank you so much, Christine. From our point of view as Human Rights Watch, community resistance is essentially about communities identifying and asserting their rights as members in the context of mining. Such rights as the rights to be consulted to prior informed consent, the right to say no, and the rights to a rights-based approach to development in their communities. So we believe that mining should happen in a way that is respectful of a set of standards, including human rights standards. And this is why Human Rights Watch is part of the EMA group, together with others, to push for the protection of these standards and for companies and others to adhere to these standards. So when we see communities and individuals in those communities asserting their rights, that is, in my view, what amounts to community resistance. And it's important to be fully aware of the set of rights that must be respected. As Human Rights Watch, we have investigated and documented human rights abuses in the context of mining, for example, in Zimbabwe, in the Marange diamond fields in the east of the country. And we have raised concern together with the communities about human rights abuses. And we have said and provided recommendations on how mining of diamonds can happen in a way that is respectful of human rights. So we believe that this is the essence of having EMA there, civil society in that space, community representatives, mining representatives in that multilateral framework to be able to have this common set of standards that we can push for together and ensure that at the end of the day, the rights of the individuals and the communities are respected. And in that way, it improves their lives. So it's about improving people's lives. It's about ensuring that there is no harm that is done to communities. And when there are concerns, communities come together and demand and assert their rights.
Thank you so much, Dewa, and thank you for joining us.
Yeah.
And I'll turn to you, Glenn. Glenn Mpufane is the Director of Mining for the Industrial Global Union. We're so pleased you could be with us as well, Glenn, to share your experience. What does community resistance mean for you, and what do you see as some drivers for unions, for communities that you are working with?
Thanks, Christy, once again, and for the invitation, and hello to my fellow panelists. I think for us as trade unions, community resistance is not homogeneous, as you say, it owes largely to what drives that resistance, and to the extent that we see a intersection of interests, with community and indigenous people struggles, we consider ourselves or workers as part of that community resistance. It is powerful when it is, the resistance is part of a coalition, if you like, of communities, indigenous peoples, workers, but when they have defined a common interest, right? So for workers, we think that, mine workers are in the front line of that resistance, because they're impacted, as it were, what you call double jeopardy. They're impacted both as workers, at the coalface, and as community members, when they leave the workplace. Resistance come as a response for workers to, the violations, of their basic human rights, as human beings first and as workers. And there is, if you like, there is so much that one can speak about, particularly if you think about occupational health and safety in the first instance, the industry is known to have visited upon mine workers, horrific, occupational lung diseases, and as recent as currently in Australia, where the black lung disease, which we thought had long been eradicated, has emerged, with horrific, consequences. COVID-19 has basically exposed even, as well, if you like, the impact, that the industry has had on mine workers, in terms of, issues around livelihoods, working conditions, in terms of, what you call externalizing the costs, the cost burden, of that impact to communities. It's not visible in the balance sheet. It's something that is a burden to not only mine workers, but to not to the mining companies, but to workers and communities. So for us, we see community resistance as part of that response to violations, of human rights of workers and communities, and it comes in many shapes and forms.
Christy,
yes,
if I could just add one thing that I don't think we've mentioned here yet, it's part of the opening in all of this, is that, when we talk about the mining sector and industrial scale mining, we're holding two difficult coexisting truths. And one is that many mines are producing materials that many industrialized societies use every day, whether it's in our phones or cars, appliances, and in particular, this attention on renewable energy, right? Wind turbines and solar panels and the batteries that hold energy moving away from fossil fuels. And so you will have many say, look, everyone is using this stuff and it's got to come from somewhere. And that is the truth. However, the extraction of those materials right now is frequently causing impacts to environmental and social values, including human rights, that may persist for not a few years or a few decades, but for centuries to come. Like, we're looking at 7 generations plus damage handed down from the impacts that come from the consumption of these materials right now. And in part, that's because the last 50 to 100 years of this extraction has really valued for the mining sector the greatest amount of extraction of material at the lowest possible cost. But it has not valued the same level of research and development and investment into least harm, whether that's for the communities who live there or the environment there. So part of this work is to take these two existing truths that many people are using these materials, but they are creating a devastating harm that may persist for centuries. How can we hand on a reclamation cost and active maintenance cost to 300 years ahead in our future? You know, that seems untenable as much as our struggle right now with climate change does. And in a climate stressed world, addressing how we can create value to use these materials, reuse these materials, recycle, retrieve, and where we still need to extract, do so in a way that fundamentally changes the way we extract, so that kind of legacy is not handed down to the communities who live closest to those materials.
Thank you, Amy. And Irma, over more than a decade, has defined what responsible mining means through the IRMA standard for responsible mining, with input from across many sectors, directly affected communities, labor unions, NGOs, purchasing companies, mining companies, governments, academics. And the standard looks at environmental, social, economic issues, a whole range of issues, and over 400 requirements for companies to move towards responsible mining. And this is important because we can't focus on addressing climate issues and at the same time turn our heads away and our focus away from protecting Indigenous rights, protecting human rights, protecting labor rights. So we're looking at ways to keep our focus equally on all of these issues, so that while we're moving to a low carbon energy based economy, as we extract minerals to source this economy, we're doing that in a way that is absolutely respecting Indigenous rights and respecting human rights, that we can't do one without the other and call ourselves green or clean or responsible. So, you know, Irma hears stories from around the world on a regular basis about, you know, the impacts at the mine site level, at community level, and even at the mineral processing level, related to minerals like graphite, lithium, cobalt, and others. And the need for increased production to meet demands for the renewable energy transition. And I wonder, for our panelists, what this has meant for you and communities that you are part of and that you represent, what you're hearing about this green energy transition. And anyone who wants to start, I won't put you on the spot if you'd like to volunteer.
Well, if I may,
Please.
I think, you know, that is the contemporary challenge, as you know, you put it right now, and whether that you know, potentially present a seismic shift, you know, in how minerals are produced, and unless for workers, unless we do things differently, it will be more of the same, you know, as things change, you know, to the extent that they will change, you know, the pressures of the Paris, you know, I mean, climate change agreement, you know, the Paris agreement, and you know, the speed with which companies are positioning themselves, you know, to take advantage of that. And it should not be at the cost. You know, our mantra is that it should not be at the cost of livelihoods. It should not be at the cost of, you know, workers' rights. It should be at the cost of communities. We shouldn't have to pay. You know, workers shouldn't have to pay for that. You know, and the question we ask ourselves is, you know, what will industrial citizenship look like for workers under a low carbon energy future? And already I think there's a common kind of voice that says that demand must be mediated, you know, to avoid the unbridled quest for profit, you know, on the back of this, you know, I mean, a transition, you know, which will represent a race to the bottom if it is not mediated, both for in our sectors, both upstream mine workers and downstream the value chain, you know. So, and that is why what we're asking ourselves, what will we do differently to ensure that we hold these, you know, mining companies or the, you know, mineral, you know, I mean, producing companies to account. And this is where, I mean, initiatives like EMA are becoming so important for us, and the many more proliferations, you know, that are seem to be emerging that are mineral specific, cobalt, lithium, copper, and so on, you know. And what we've seen as the rising tide of mandatory due diligence, you know, so it's an opportunity, if you like, you know, to do things differently. To the extent that workers can have access to these protections, you know, that are being made available during this transition. So it's a huge challenge, you know, for workers in terms of, is this an opportunity or a challenge, you know? We've been there before. What is different, and what your argument is that things might be different to the extent that there is access to remedy mechanisms, you know, available for communities, for workers, for the environment, for climate change, and so on and so on, you know. Yeah.
Thank you, Glenn. Dewa, Nusmata, anything you would add?
Yep, thank you. Yeah, I wish to add that yes, EMA is really a key cog in terms of responses and finding ways to address issues of community concerns, human rights standards. And this is why, as Human Rights Watch, we are part of EMA, because we want to hold up this common set of, you know, standards that we can all adhere to, be it industry, be it communities, be it activists. And the emerging challenges that you have highlighted around renewable energy, we are just saying that we need to adapt and ensure that there is a comprehensive response that is rights-based, that ensures that we do not fail to address the human rights concerns that are associated with these emerging issues that we are now confronted with as new challenges. And For us as Human Rights Watch, we are looking to the human rights framework locally at national level, regionally, as well as globally, to say how can we continue to use the human rights framework to address these concerns and ensure that there is the protection of common set of values of the rights of individuals and adherence to a common set of standards that will ensure that there is no harm done to the communities.
Thank you, Dewa.
One other thing I would like to add is just thinking in terms of existing mines already coming on board and communities using the standard of IRMA and all of the connections, I think, with IRMA as well, the different expertise that comes into these conversations that have informed the standard, and looking at it globally in terms of being this highest standard. And for our communities, that's the place, that's the jumping off point to begin conversations with companies is what is the highest standard in the world? Let's start there to begin with. And let's look at our own laws from our own values and our own vision and our own, community input into this process. Because when you think about, resistance, it's because there's disagreement. It's because there's systems in place that don't serve the people who live in those places. And so I think IRMA as a tool, the standard, but also the governance process, I think is important to consider as well. How communities can be engaged and can be engaged even if the companies who are operating in their lands aren't engaged, can use this as a way of saying, look, there's a better way to do this. Kind of a form of harm reduction. When I think of the mines in my territory, if they were to sign on to IRMA, things would be in a much better place, I think, in terms of the conversations happening between the communities and the companies and the industry, actually. So I think that there are a lot of ways that things can be improved. And there's a lot of expertise coming from local communities in terms of how the long-term sustainability of that area from that local knowledge and the people who are directly impacted should have a say. And I think that this is slowly starting to, I think, reach the mining industry, that they can't avoid this anymore. And let's start having these conversations, and let's, start protecting the people who are in these places. It's just such, I'm thinking of the laws in Canada are so outdated, and we need to get updated, and we need to be thinking about the future in a different way. We need to be protecting water long-term. We need to protecting different sources, especially when we're thinking about climate crisis that we're in. So I think that it's a really good tool for communities to be looking at and to be using, especially if they don't have a standard of their own. It's a really great place to start.
Christy, picking up on something Nusmata said there, about the disconnect that's felt by communities is that I've had some reporters and mining industry leaders say to me, don't these communities understand that we need lithium, we need cobalt, we need these materials that are associated with renewable energy. But what I often hear our community sector say is like, look, on the Navajo Nation in the US, you had Dene people living without power next to thermal coal extraction, right? And now you still have Indigenous people living without power next to lithium extraction, the Atacama and Chile. And so you have these people going, this is the disconnect, right? Is that whatever these materials are going to, they're frequently going from an affluent company off to an affluent receiving community at the end of consumers. And those of us who are living in the place of extraction, we feel like we're repeatedly the overdrawn bank account of the world's global resources for its own consumptive hunger, to what Glenn said. So for many of those communities, they're not saying, they're not blind to the fact the materials are going into green energy. They often tend to be on the front line of the impacts of climate change. They're not immune to what does climate change mean. And insensitive to that, but they're saying, look, we heard the same arguments that are being used now for these new materials, for materials that have been extracted to our harm over the last 50 plus years. If you just substitute that same claim on new materials, what we're just seeing is more excuses for extraction, and private company profit. We need to see something different. So I think that's to what Nuskman is saying as well about, what's the benefit sharing? What's the insurance that harm is not going to be done, and that there's going to be value on that post-mining use and the community's experience of extraction being there. And to Glenn's point on what value are we putting on this idea of circular economy, of materials retrieval and recycling? There are so many subsidies financially and legal incentives for new extraction that don't exist for the recycling and materials retrieval space. Is that what can we do so that extraction isn't the obvious go-to as our response to climate change?
Thank you so much, Amy. And for those participants who are not familiar with IRMA, what is the first step for a community who wants to encourage a company to participate in IRMA, or for a company who wants to learn more about how to participate?
So if you are in a community, or as Glenn mentioned, if mine workers, where mining is happening or it's proposed, I mean, first off, you can pick up the IRMA standard as a template for what is responsible mining, and you can do a gap analysis, if you will, look at, how is the mine in your area operating or proposing to operate, and how does that measure against what a multi-stakeholder group has looked at over a decade and defined as best practices, and where is the gap? And that can become a list of asks for the mining company in your region. As Nusmana mentioned, it can be part of what Indigenous peoples use as part of their consent. In free, prior, and informed consent, they can say, in addition to the things we want in our territory specifically, we have these asks between how you're operating or how you propose to operate and how best practices are defined here. Where there is an active or proposed mine already existing, community can ask for that to be audited against the IRMA standard. Why would you do that? Well, you would do that because you want the increased access to information. An IRMA audit yields about 100 pages of very detailed, independently evaluated results on environmental and social performance there. So the amount that a community can know about where are the risks, where is harm happening, where are their strengths, where are the things maybe we don't need to be as worried about, because we can see we have an independent arbiter who said that actually these places are actual strengths for it. There are many communities who are concerned about, will that be used though for greenwashing? Will there be auditors who are corrupted? And based on the experience many communities have had with auditors, it's perfectly reasonable. They have that skepticism. But these are independently trained auditors who are accountable for most to the IRMA system. They can lose their accreditation and approval to serve IRMA audits if they inappropriately report results. And any stakeholder can also file a complaint or concern, whether that's a mining company who feels that auditors don't have things right, or a community-based group or workers. Also, community-based groups and workers and NGOs are involved in the audit. It's a transparently, publicly noticed audit, so anyone can participate. So if it's in your home community, you have a direct line to those auditors to say the things you're concerned with. And then as one of the first audits, which happened in Zimbabwe at the Unki Platinum Mine, that was an Anglo-American mine, you had an NGO working with community-based groups there, the Zimbabwe Environmental Law Association. They picked up the audit report afterwards and looked through the points that auditors found that the mine didn't meet. And now they're using that as a starting point for a conversation with the mining company about which of those issues are most important to them. So then it's not IRMA's conversation. It's not IRMA saying you have to fill in these requirements you don't meet. It's the community saying, look, out of these requirements you don't meet yet, these are the ones that are most important to us. And we'd like you to focus there first. It's an opportunity for more positive communication between a community that's living with a mine in their region and the company that's there. Or we're about to have a new standard that in draft that looks at exploration and development. So for those proposed projects that aren't yet constructed, where a community can measure that against what would be best practice in that space as well.
Thank you so much, Amy. And for a company that wants to sign up, would they first become a member, start a self-audit? What would be their first step?
They're welcome to apply to participate in our membership program, but they do not have to be a member in order to engage. They have access to a self-assessment tool, which first allows them to run themselves through the full IRMA standard. So it's not a surprise how they're likely to score on each one. And it allows them to find places where they may have weaknesses that they didn't even realize and begin to address those issues. With the help of Nuskmata and Glenn and Dewa and others, we're also working a companion tool for community-based groups to do the same thing, to run themselves the mine in their region or the proposed mine in their region through this and have the community's lens on how do we think the company is doing right now. But so a mining company, though, would start with that tool. Because of COVID right now in our COVID response program, it's free to access. Once they're ready, they can use that tool confidentially as they want, if they want it. But once they're ready to do independent auditing, that moves to being a transparent process where the world has an opportunity to engage in that audit. That's the only and first place where money then is involved, and it's paying not IRMA, but it's paying the auditors who would then audit the mine.
Terrific. Well, some see this as a moment of this as a moment of opportunity while we have increased focus on climate action and increased demand for particular mineral resources, as an opportunity to really bridge what have been historically divergent interests in some cases and really work together in new ways to ensure that where mining takes place, it proceeds in an environmentally and socially responsible manner, respecting the rights of local communities, respecting Indigenous peoples and their rights, respecting the environment. And I wonder, from our panelists' view, what you think about this. Is this an opportunity moment? And Dewa, let's start with your perspectives.
Thank you so much. I believe that indeed this is an opportune moment, and that frameworks such as IRMA are uniquely designed to address these challenges, and that it is really about more members of civil society globally coming together, partnering or working within IRMA, labor movements, industry, purchasers, community representatives, so that we have a comprehensive response that addresses the different multifaceted concerns that would arise, and addressed in a balanced way the concerns that industry might have, that communities have, that the labor movement, as Glenn has indicated. So absolutely, I believe that it's a huge opportunity, and that IRMA is uniquely placed to be able to assist with that, so that when you have, at the end of the day, we are able to achieve that kind of balance. When you talk, for example, of mining, that is not just about, those that are at the source feeling that they are paying, or bearing the cost of mining, but not the benefits. But that maybe those that are more affluent at the receiving end are the beneficiaries alone, but not being fully aware about the context in which the mining takes place. Thanks.
Thank you, Dewa. Nuskmata, what are your thoughts on this? Is this an opportunity moment?
Yeah, I think we, thinking in terms of climate crisis, we're out of time, and thinking ahead to how we go forward with renewable energy, greenwashing, dirty practices of mining that need to be changed, and just saying, oh, well, we need it for this transition. That's not a good way to do things in terms of long-term sustainability. We have a crisis opportunity right now where we need to be taking advantage of this moment, and we need to be doing the work now. And for communities and Indigenous nations that are against mining, I think that this conversation, we need to be part of this conversation as well, for those values to come through, and for a different vision in these different places to come through as well. I'm thinking of the Nuklalk Nation, which I'm a part of, and the Nuklalk Nation has recently very publicly stated that we're against all forms of mining in our area because of our very specific location in the world, in the Great Bear Rainforest. In terms of climate crisis, we need our forest here, which is very unique on Earth, to be protected. And so there are different types of industries and economies that can exist here in a really good way, but mining isn't one of them. And so understanding the reasons behind why communities are making decisions, I think, is also a really important part of this, and that it all needs to be framed in terms of this emergency that we're in, this climate crisis, and look at what our glaciers are melting in our mountains here, and so mining companies are interested in coming in, but what are the impacts to the water? What are the impacts to the forests with the deglaciation that we don't know yet? There's so many variables that we have to consider in our long-term planning, and looking to these standards. I think, like, looking to what other people are doing around the world right now in terms of responding to this crisis is really important, and that we take a very informed and purposeful and really engaged approach to dealing with these things, because they're all connected and we can't disconnect them in these conversations. We can't think about mining in the Great Bear Rainforest without considering the impacts to salmon and to killer whales and to endangered species. And so, like, there's a lot more to consider than just one specific mining operation. And I think that that's a really important part of the conversation as well. And how do we do the renewable energy in a good, sustainable way? What are the recycling opportunities that we can look at? What are the different technologies that are more sustainable, right? And how does Indigenous knowledge inform how these technologies are used in these places? How is the community impacted, and how does the community benefit in a way that is long-term and sustainable? These are the questions that we're asking in our nation. So I think that the conversations that are happening now around the world, there needs to be more connection with each other for the learning. And this includes looking at mining and how we can improve things in mining as well.
Thank you so much, Nuskmata. There's so much to learn from all of the communities represented on this panel, including yours. So thank you for sharing. Glenn, what would you add? Is this an opportunity moment?
I think what I think Jacinda's articulation, I think, goes to the heart of the tension, as it were, in this mining space. What I said about divergent and common interests, and these conversations are necessary because they are not just juxtaposed, or they are not polar. And this is what Emma is trying to do, to bring together this difficult, sometimes often antagonistic positions, captured in what could be termed what is responsible mining, to the extent that there is such a thing as, because instinctively workers, would push back against the notion of no to mining, but to the extent that it is context specific, taking into account what Jacinda has been articulating, but coming to your question, is your question cries out for what we call a just transition, and which is, I think, a concept, that speaks to how all these values, that we hold dear in this transition can be kept alive, the notion that justice and equity must form an integral part of the transition. And this is, I think, the premise from which we move. And it is a fundamental building block, just transition is a fundamental building block for the environmental protection, social, and so on, For workers, we hold that concept very dear because the transition must not end up representing more than a nice funeral for workers, so to speak. But what is the future looks like, what's going to happen to these mine workers toiling? It is not their fault that their industry is suddenly labeled as dirty, and therefore, allowed to be dumped in, onto the scrap heap of production history. There's a huge pushback, against well-intentioned, in Europe and in Australia and South Africa, emission targets that basically, or policy responses, that do not take into account the needs of working people. How are working people going to be accommodated? And that is the challenge, and which we must confront together. And this is a conversation that we're involved with, in the ILO, in all international platforms, about how does the future of work look like, essentially. And for us, I think that is the bottom line, so to speak, because however you configure the new world, you cannot do away with labor. But what type of labor? And climate change should not be, posed as a threat, an existential threat to the world of work. So we want to be part of that conversation that ensures, as I said, a bright future for workers, a future that sounds good, attractive to today's workers, and which we can buy into. And it is only in that context that we see opportunities, while at the same time, we protect the planet, which is at the heart of workers' concerns as well. There are no jobs on a dead planet, and I think that illustrates the point about, the position that workers find themselves in. On the one hand, we must fight for the protection of the planet, and on the other, we must ensure, that the future of work is provided. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Glenn. There's so much to unpack in your remarks, and your really rich remarks. But one question I want to ask, in case any of our participants are not familiar with the ILO, who is the ILO, and what does the ILO mean for your work in industrial?
The International Labour Organization, is one of the oldest, if you like, agencies in the UN system. 1912, it was established, and it has spearheaded, the whole notion around dialogue, tripartite dialogue, where, the social partners, and that has become a model around the world, where, a dialogue on any issue in the world of work can be brought to the social partners. And the work of the ILO, manifests in the conventions, many conventions, the ILO conventions, we call them, like, the Health and Safety in Mines Convention, conventions on the fundamental rights at work, and those are agreed by social partners at the ILO governing body in Geneva, annually, and they are then codified in law, and domesticated in national law, and this is where, as a policy response, accountability for how production is done responsibly, across the whole world of work. Yeah, so that is the International Labour Organization, where these conversations around the world of work happen.
Thank you so much. And in the IRMA standard for responsible mining, we integrate ILO standards as part of the best practice framework that we've put together for mines to follow. But Amy, I'd like to close with your remarks. Do you find this to be an opportunity moment?
I do. I mean, I think this is a tremendous moment for a permission slip for many who are entering the workforce or others who are seasoned and have been there for decades to think about this new world vision that Dewa and Nuskmata and Glenn have described. As I said, there have been for so long a global first world affluent market demand for materials to be extracted at least cost. I think that the pain of going through the suffering associated with the world's public health crisis and with climate change converging at the same time gives us an opportunity moment and an absolute existential reason to have to say we're going to do things fundamentally different. And what is that going to look like? I think there have been a lot of really wonderful geology students, students of community rights and justice, of lawyers who have come through programs who want to do good in the world and have been constrained by a set of market factors that have limited to financial value alone. And I think now we are seeing that financial value, as Glenn said so well, there are no jobs on a dead planet, and so powerfully laid out there. I think this is a moment where innovators who say there's a different way we're going to do this kind of extraction, recycling, materials retrieval, we're going to reduce consumption, we're going to increase durability so you don't need to replace that phone, that car, that ring every few years, is that can we come up with a new paradigm? And I think it's a really exciting permission slip moment in its urgency.
Thank you so much, Amy. Any final burning thoughts any of the other panelists would like to share before we close?
I just want to share what Emma means to ordinary workers, mine workers on the shop floor. You have no idea about, the sense of worth that comes with, a worker being part of the audit process, to the extent that their voices are heard, they are spoken to, they are asked about their lived experiences, for us, what it approximates what one could call a shared value proposition, to the extent that you hear what I've got to say and what are you going to do about it. The access to remedy mechanism, that accompanies the EMMA standard, and it goes to your initial question, I think, Christy, in the beginning, about what EMMA means, not only to me sitting at the board, but to those workers that are toiling every day, knowing that they have a chance without the presence of management, without the presence of the bosses, to be able to speak their reality as they experience it. So that's a very powerful moment for workers in the EMMA process.
Thank you so much. A really unique part of IRMA's audit process is that we require that the auditors speak not only to company management, but to mine workers, to local community members, to NGOs, to government officials, so that there's a really holistic view of the mine at the mine site level. So the audits are conducted at the site level, and that's really important. So thank you for those reflections. Dewa, Nuskmata, any additional closing thoughts from either of you?
jump in and give Dewa the last word. Yeah, just thinking of the audience that's listening to this and thinking of the students and the new professionals that are coming in, to be really aware of the language of resistance and this concept of Indigenous peoples and others being resistant to mining, that there are the bigger conversations to keep in mind when, if there's a community or a nation that's resisting, that there's work and relationships that haven't been, engaged in or haven't been invested into. So keeping that in mind, and also keeping an open mind of the learning opportunities as well, for framing your work, and to remember that this is a bigger, huge systemic shift as well, and to think of those things when you're considering all of the different pieces that may be framed as resistance, and that they are opportunities as well for change. And we need you. We need everybody in this conversation and doing this heavy work. And so I just want to thank you. Thank you for being on this panel, and thank people for really taking this to heart.
Thank you, Nuskamada.
Yeah, thank you. I think my last word would be to say that initiatives like Emma are very important in that you are looking at a multi-sectoral, multilateral approach where you have different groups, different sectors coming together to provide solutions, to find ways of achieving a common goal. And this is quite unique, where you have civil society sitting at the same table with the industry in EMA, with labor, with community groups, with purchasers, to say, how do we identify the best practices and how do we implement them as a set of common values? And I think this is quite important for people on the ground, because for those that we work with in the communities, the human rights activists on the ground, what they want are solutions. And this is what we are presenting through this framework, to say, if you want to have the promotion and protection of basic rights, of labor standards, then you have to have a framework. It's voluntary. It brings people together, but it ensures that there are standards that can be pointed to and adhered to, and ultimately lead to an improvement in people's lives. And this is what this initiative is all about. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all of the participants who are viewing our panel. You can learn more about IRMA at responsiblemIning.net. And on that website, you can also find our contact information and reach out to us, link to us on social media, LinkedIn, Twitter. We'd love to stay in touch with you, sign up for our newsletter, and we'll also put that information on the Mining Law Summit homepage. Thank you so much for joining us.